Hola, buenas tardes y bienvenidos a esta primera conferencia, este primer webinar del mes de julio, pero también decimos con cierta tristeza el último de este ciclo de conferencias que hemos hecho con el máster oficial de estudios globales de Asia Oriental de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Y hoy vamos a hablar de Japón, vamos a hablar de la gobernanza global y de todas estas instituciones que empiezan a emerger para dar cierto sentido a esa transformación en la gobernanza global que estamos creando. La conferencia va a ser en inglés, recuerden que pueden hacer preguntas en el chat y nada, bienvenidos a esta primera y última conferencia del ciclo, primera de julio. Y tienes la palabra Blay para que Blay y David para que nos introduzcáis el ciclo, el máster y nada, cuando quieras, Blay.
Muchas gracias, Rafa. Well, thank you very much, Rafa. It's a pleasure to be in Casa Asia again, our second home in this lecture series on global East Asian studies. Thanks are due, as always, to Casa Asia for its support organizing, along with the MA in Global East Asian Studies and the Gaggle Research Group, both at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona, at the UAB, this lecture series. I welcome everyone to this session. Bienvenidos a todos y todas to this online seminar. It's great to see you here again in this space for knowledge and discussion on East Asia and its influence in the world. This is our last lecture in our lecture series on what we call Global East Asian Studies. This is the impact, cultural, political, economic impact of East Asia in a global world. During the last 4 months, we have enjoyed the work of distinguished lecturers such as Christopher Den from Edge Hill University, Jimin Park from Seoul National University and Sciences Po Paris, Daniel Mendez Moran from the project Gs y China, Lola Martinez from SOAS and the University of Oxford, Juan Liu from China Agricultural University and the ICTA at the UAB, and tonight, Hugo Dobson from the Sheffield University. Thanks to all of them, we have had the fantastic opportunity to discuss on several key issues related to East Asia, from the environment and climate change to the economic presence of China in Latin America, South Korean cultural industries, focusing especially on K-pop, Japanese cinema and its Western remakes, and tonight, Japan's international relations with Professor Dobson. All these lectures have followed the main drivers of this new paradigm on global East Asian studies that we are developing from the research group Gaggle and our MA program at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. This is the theoretical paradigm that joins the traditional field of knowledge of regional studies, area studies, a field of knowledge shaping the geopolitical order of the Cold War, which is radically different from the international scenario that we have today, and the emerging paradigm of global studies, which nowadays is being developed from disciplines such as global governance, global economy, transcultural studies, global history and literature, global media, and so. Well, it is a truism to say that in the last decades, East Asia has become a main Asian of transregional influence. As we all know, East Asia has overflowed its traditional regional limits which, by the way, were defined in the 19th century by the Western powers. And actually, this overflowing of East Asia throughout the world is the topic and the approach of our MA program on global East Asian studies at the UAB. So before introducing you to Professor Hugo Dobson, please allow me to give the floor to Professor David Sauri, from the UAB, the coordinator of our MA program, in order to briefly introduce to you our study program. So David, now I'm going to share the screen here. And here it is. So David.
Thank you very much, Blay, for this introduction. Hugo, if you excuse me, I will speak in Spanish regarding just a brief comment, a brief presentation of this MA. Bueno, esto, como ha comentado el profesor Warné, es un máster oficial en el que denominamos Estudios Globales de Asia Oriental, precisamente por lo que comentaba el profesor Warné, ¿no? Para estudiar un poco la creciente influencia de los países de Asia Oriental en el mundo, ¿no? En este caso es muy importante señalar que nuestro objetivo es aprender, estudiar, no tanto sobre estos países de manera interna, para eso ya tenemos un grado de 4 años también en estudios de Asia Oriental, sino más que nada mirar hacia afuera, ¿no? Mirar un poco sobre su influencia global, ¿no? Y esto lo concretamos pues, en un máster de 60 créditos que tiene varias asignaturas troncales, 2 de muy importantes, por ejemplo, en ámbito todo lo que es la influencia de Asia en productos culturales, discursos representacionales, identidades, etcétera, etcétera, todo el apartado de la cultura. Y luego también otro módulo muy central al máster, que es el módulo que denominamos de geopolítica, economía y medio ambiente, ¿no? Igualmente para ver en temas la influencia, evidentemente, pues cosas como, por ejemplo, el Belt and Road de chino, todo lo que es el boom de la economía coreana, por ejemplo, toda las cuestiones muy relevantes medioambientales, como por ejemplo el papel de estos países tanto en contribuir al efecto invernadero y al cambio climático global, como también en recibir pues sus consecuencias más negativas en forma de fenómenos extremos en la naturaleza, aumentos del nivel del mar, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Estos 2 módulos se enseñan en el primer semestre y en el segundo semestre pasamos a ver otro módulo muy importante, que es un módulo de política y sociedad, En este sentido, es un módulo que ya hay una cierta tradición en estudios de posgrado de la Universidad Autónoma en estudiar cuestiones de política y sociedad en Asia Oriental. Luego tenemos también módulos optativos que no ofrecemos nosotros, sino que se ofrecen desde otros programas de máster, pero de temas muy relevantes, ¿no? Por ejemplo, temas de movilidad, de transporte, el tema del turismo, otro fenómeno evidentemente de alcance global muy importante, el tema de los medios de comunicación, que sería el tercero, ¿no? Y luego tenemos módulos más de trabajo más práctico, como el módulo de estudios de caso, que intenta, como dice el nombre, plasmar en ejercicios prácticos pues todo lo que hemos aprendido e intentado aprender en los módulos módulos más culturales, módulos de geopolítica o el módulo de política y sociedad. Y el máster finaliza con un trabajo de fin de máster de 15 créditos, que es un plan bastante ambicioso, que en parte se puede hacer como un ejercicio de investigación, pero también se puede hacer en el marco de colaboración con una serie de instituciones que este año ya hemos tenido la oportunidad de celebrar, pues como la propia Casa Asia, a la que siempre hemos agradecido porque ha acogido a muchos estudiantes nuestros que estaban interesados en hacer este trabajo de fin de máster dentro de el marco de Casa Asia, pero también el Instituto Sejong de Corea, el Instituto Confucio, por ejemplo, y otras entidades, ¿no? Entonces, pues esto es un poco la estructura, son 60 créditos, hay créditos optativos, pero generalmente la idea es esta, ¿no? Y bueno, este año hemos celebrado, justo estamos ahora terminando la primera edición y la semana que viene vamos a tener la oportunidad de presentar los primeros trabajos de fin de máster, ¿no? Y yo estoy con una gran curiosidad porque el primer trabajo quiero destacar que es sobre una cosa que yo no sabía en absoluto, que el profesor Warner conoce muy bien, que es sobre el fenómeno, Blay, corrígeme porque yo no sé japonés y no sé si lo pronunciaré bien, los yokai, ¿no? Los yokai. Exactamente. En la cultura japonesa, estas figuras míticas de, digamos, de espíritus, etcétera, etcétera, y cómo han revivido a través del manga, anime, videojuegos, etcétera, etcétera. Yo que no tengo ni la más remota idea de este tema, más bien me dedico a temas de medio ambiente, he disfrutado muchísimo leyendo este trabajo y creo que es el tipo de trabajo de fin de máster que vamos a tener. Este es el primero, con bastante variedad de temas, etcétera, etcétera. Bueno, nosotros buscamos perfiles de todo tipo, de gente que esté interesada, no nos basamos exclusivamente en lo que son digamos, el conocimiento de las lenguas. Nos interesa mucho ofrecer una formación interdisciplinar, nos interesa mucho tener alumnos que vengan digamos, de grados variados, preferentemente de ciencias sociales y humanidades, pero este año también hemos tenido un ingeniero informático, por ejemplo, que está muy interesado en temas de movilidad urbana y está haciendo el TFM sobre Hong Kong. O sea que buscamos estos perfiles también más variados, ¿no? Y luego un poco el tema de las salidas profesionales, eso es lo que esperamos, por supuesto, esto es una, digamos, son todas las posibilidades, ¿no? Hay trabajos de consultoría, de asesoría económica, trabajamos con una empresa coreana, por ejemplo, que la señora que es la propietaria de la empresa pues nos da clases, ofrece prácticas, etcétera, etcétera. Todo el tema de las industrias culturales, creativas, contenidos, comunicación, marketing, gestión cultural, el tema del turismo, muy importante también a nivel global. Esperemos este año, como se podrá imaginar, el turismo, al menos en Barcelona, el turismo asiático y todo el turismo en general, pues ha sido un año terrible, ¿no? Pero bueno, esto se puede recuperar y hay interés además del tradicional interés de los japoneses por Gaudí, pues empieza a emerger un turismo chino, un turismo coreano, o sea que también en este ámbito también se pueden encontrar posibilidades de trabajo. No me quiero extender más, muchísimas gracias, os animo a consultar la página web y en este caso, pues, también muy satisfecho de este ciclo y agradecido a Casa Asia por acogernos y esperar que el año que viene podamos repetir con un nuevo ciclo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, David. Many thanks, David. Creo que ya no estoy compartiendo en pantalla, ¿verdad?
No.
Perfecto, pues muchas gracias. Many thanks, David. So it is now a real pleasure to introduce you to Professor Hugo Dobson, who is going to talk about one of the main areas of expertise of our MA program on Global East Asian Studies, which is international relations, in this case of Japan. Dr. Dobson is Professor of International Relations of Japan at the School of East Asian Studies at the University of Sheffield. His research interests focus on international relations, multilateral organizations, and global governance, especially on the role of East Asian countries in the G7 and the G20. He has published several books and articles, and he has been invited to teach and research at various institutions around the world, including our university, the UAB, during this week in what has been a great PhD mini course. We also have the pleasure of having with us as a discussant, Julia Bañeras, a Cooperation Officer for Asia at the European Commission, Directorate General for International Partnership. Julia is a former student of our BA on East Asian Studies at the UAB, and she has a master in global security at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. She has specialized in Japan, and she has worked at the United Nations in Geneva, among other institutions. Well, many thanks, Professor Dobson, of course. Many thanks, Julia, for accepting our invitation. It is great to have you both as distinguished lecturer and also a discussant. Please, to the audience, feel free to post your questions and comments using the chat for the final discussion that will be conducted by Julia. And well, let's start, because tonight in this session, Professor Dobson is going to talk about the relationship of Japan with what he calls a gaggle of Gs. Something quite difficult to translate into Spanish. Actually, a gaggle is a kind of a messy group, a cluster without a clear organization. So we have translated into Spanish as tropel, which is not a very common word, that's true. But it is a better word than pandilla, multitud, or even grupo, that don't fit as well to this idea of chaotic international aggregation, but finally an important aggregation, a political one, international one. So many thanks, Professor Dobson, for accepting our invitation. It is a real pleasure to host your lecture tonight. And please, the floor is yours whenever you want. Please, the floor
Thank you very much, Bly. And good evening, everyone. Let me just try and share my screen. Hopefully that's working okay. Great, excellent. So yeah, I just want to sort of begin by saying thank you and apologies. You know, often we start talks like this with a thank you and an apology, but also to sort of maybe even have a joke as well. We'll see. So thank you to Bly and UAB. I've had a wonderful week here in Barcelona, although I've done it from the comfort of my office in Sheffield. I'm probably the only British person alive who's never been to Spain, so I was really looking forward to possibly visiting Barcelona. But maybe sometime in the future it'll come to pass. But I've had a wonderful week teaching a mini course to some of the students at UAB. So thank you very much to Blythe for the invitation. Thank you to Casa Asia for the invitation to speak to you tonight. And it's a wonderful way to round off a wonderful week. So thank you very much. I should apologise first of all, because you may hear some background noise as I speak. I've got two small children, Alex, who's 5, and Iris, who's 7, and they are quite excitable, especially this time in the evening. So if you hear any background noises, I do apologise. I think we're probably quite used to it now. There used to be a time, once upon a time, it used to be quite a novelty for children to walk in on interviews and seminars while you were online, but now I think we're just used to it and we accommodate it. So that's my thank you, that's my apology. Maybe we've not got time for a joke just yet. Maybe we can, the G7 and the G20 doesn't seem like the most obviously funny subject, but possibly there'll be opportunities for the joke later on, we'll see. And also, just as an aside, I'd like to say I really appreciate learning what the Spanish translation of gaggle is, tropel. I've spoken in Japan about this before in the past, and the Japanese word that has come up has been kenso. But again, they sort of struggle to translate it. Gaggle, I mean, in English, we use gaggle as a collective noun to describe a collection of geese. So the idea is noisy, it's cacophonous, it's chaotic. And that's the sense that we're trying to get with this term, a gaggle of Gs, that there's been a proliferation of informal G groups within global governance. So what I'm going to talk about over the next sort of 40 minutes or so is to talk about the G7 and the G20, because they are often some of the most misunderstood mechanisms of global governance. Often we just see the photographs of the leaders shaking hands, and that's about the extent to which we understand these groups. And they are very distinct in what they can do and what they can't do in the way that they function. So I'll talk a little bit about the G7 and the G20, the way they relate to each other and their role in global governance, before then talking about recent developments and how we now have this gaggle of Gs. I've then quickly got a couple of proposals to make as regards the development of each of them, what the G7 should focus on and what might happen in the G20 in relation to Asia's role. But then I'll focus more on Japan's role and talk about how Japan has navigated this gaggle of Gs, this tricky situation. And the image that I've got here that sort of tries to capture that is of Prime Minister Abe at the G7 summit in Charlevoix in Canada in 2018. And I think, well, I've been talking about images a lot over the last week with the students at UAB and how we understand international relations through images. But this image became sort of quite notorious as demonstrating the standoff between Europe and Trump, with Japan there in the middle, trying to play some kind of bridging role possibly between the two. But we'll get to that in due course. So the G7, what do we understand by the G7? This is a slide that I always enjoy updating every year for my students, but this demonstrates the various summits and meetings that have taken place of this group. Originally a group of 6, but the numbers, as I'll talk about, have changed over time. If we go to the top left-hand corner, you can see the first meeting of what was at the time a group of 6. So it was the leaders of France, West Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the US, and Japan. And the whole idea, this meeting took place in the Chateau of Rambouillet, outside of Paris, in November 1975, a 2-day meeting. And the idea behind it was that you needed to get the right leaders around the table. So the French president, Giscard d'Estaing, and the German chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, who'd both been finance ministers of their countries, had found it useful to have informal meetings when they were finance ministers. There was a group called the Library Group that met, and they wanted to transfer this informal mechanism to the leaders level, to upgrade it from the ministerial meeting to the leaders level. So in the face of the economic crises of the 1970s, the oil shock and so on, they decided to call this meeting of leaders in Paris. And the whole intention of the meeting was that it was going to be this informal gathering. There was no set agenda. Originally there was going to be no declaration at the end of it. In the end, there was a declaration, but the intention was to not take any notes, not have an agenda, not make a declaration, just get the leaders together for a face-to-face discussion and try and inject some political leadership into addressing the issues of the day, to try and get over the bureaucracy that was clogging up the system and try and inject some political leadership. So it had been described as a fireside chat. Let's get the leaders, the right leaders, in the room together. They can talk man to man, and it has been predominantly man to man. There's only ever been 4 women who've participated in the summit. Get the right leaders in the room and they can talk about the issues of the day. Now, it was meant to be a one-off meeting, but it was found to be a useful mechanism. So the following year in 1976, Gerald Ford hosted a meeting of the leaders. It was expanded the following year so that Canada was brought in. It was felt that it was balanced too heavily in favour of Europe, so Canada joined in 1976. The following year, and this happened organically, who would be hosting it? The rotation just developed organically, but the following year it was the London Summit in 1977. And at that summit, the European Union acquired representation at the summit table. It was felt that France, West Germany, Italy, and the UK were making decisions, sometimes which involved the whole of Europe. So the EU, as it was then, the EEC, gained representation at the summit table. The summits continued thereafter on an annual basis. I've mentioned how the membership expanded, but also this continued into the post-Cold War period. So in the 1990s, there was a long protracted process by which Russia was initially invited as a guest early on in the 1990s, but by 1997 and 1998, it was included as the formal G8. However, Russia was suspended in 2014 as a result of its intervention, its annexation of Crimea and its intervention in Ukraine, and it remains suspended. It's not been expelled, it's been suspended. There is still a route back into a G8 if Russia is interested. To be honest, I don't think Russia is interested, but we're now back to a G7. And it met most recently, just the other day, in Cornwall with Boris Johnson, my esteemed Prime Minister, hosting the G7 leaders for their first face-to-face meeting for quite some time because of the pandemic. So that's how it's developed year by year since 1975 through to 2021. I've mentioned the expansion of its membership. It's also expanded in terms of its agenda. So originally it was very much focused on macroeconomic issues, but that soon shifted to embrace political and security issues. By the end of the decade even, they were dealing with issues such as hijacking. During the 1980s, the Second Cold War kicked in and this became a focus of discussion. So the agenda was flexible. The agenda was basically whatever the leaders wanted to be on the agenda. And this could change at the last minute as well. There have been times when an event has happened on the eve of the summit, often, for example, North Korea testing missiles, or the death of Kim Il-sung, for example, that has found its way onto the summit agenda as a last-minute addition. So the idea is it's informal, it's flexible. Leaders meet because they want to meet. They can shape the agenda to include what they want to, from economic issues originally to political and security issues, then through, well, the first decade of the current millennium, that started to deal much more with issues such as aid for Africa, debt relief, climate change. And it's changed in terms of structures as well. It's originally just leaders, but they have also expanded into ministerial meetings. So G7 foreign ministers will now meet and talk about the situation in Hong Kong, for example. And they've expanded their outreach activities as well into civil society groups who are brought into the discussion ahead of the summit of leaders. So it's evolved over time, but at the heart of it, it's getting the right people round the table to talk about the issues of the day in an informal way to try and reach some consensus amongst these leaders. The Cornwall Summit was generally seen to have been a bit of a success. I think this is particularly after the events of last year and the pandemic, but also during the American presidency of the G20 last year, we didn't actually have a physical summit. There was a very brief online discussion between the leaders, but there was no actual summit. And in fact, during the 4 years that Trump was president, there was a very sort of half-hearted commitment towards the G7 from the US. And it felt at times like it was a G6+1. But now, as a result of Cornwall and the Biden administration, we get the feeling that these countries are more united than they ever have been. There was talk about creating a D10, a democracy of 10, by inviting South Korea, South Africa, and Australia, and in fact also India. So it was a D11 was the mooted number to the summit. So it seems that there's a bit of a renaissance going on. I was listening to a seminar the other day organized by CSIS in Washington, and it had the American representative, the Sherpa, the bureaucrat who assists the prime minister or the leader in the process of engaging with the summit. They had the UK Sherpa and the US Sherpa, and they were both agreeing that the G7 is probably stronger now than it's been in a long time. It's definitely, the G7 is back after a few years of having lost its way, possibly. Now, as I said, if you want to make sense of the G7, if you want to make sense of this group, I think a good way to do it is to look back in history. And for those of you who've studied your international history, you may well remember studying the concert of Europe, the informal grouping of great powers that met firstly at the Vienna Congress to decide the post-war, post-Napoleonic War order in Europe, and then would meet when necessary to deal with issues of the day as they emerged. Now, this is sort of a way to think about the G7, because the G7 it has no legal status. It has no formal position. It's informal. It doesn't have any means to enforce its decision. It's not like the UN, which is seen as the legitimate center of global governance. The UN has a charter. The G7 doesn't have that, doesn't have a constitution, doesn't have a membership criteria, doesn't have a physical headquarters, doesn't have a staff who work for it. You know, those staff don't have a pension scheme, they don't have a canteen where they eat. It's not like these formal, it's not like the WTO or the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund. It's an informal gathering. And the concept of Europe is sort of in some ways the easiest way to make sense of that. It met when it needed to deal with the issues of the day that required great power consensus, whether that was Greek or Belgian independence, for example. Now, I mention this as well because, you know, success has many parents, and not only is it Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt who sort of claim the responsibility for having created the original G7. You can also see other people like Henry Kissinger claiming the credit for having created the idea for the G7. And Henry Kissinger wrote his PhD thesis, as I'm sure many of you know, all about the concert of Europe, all about the Congress of Vienna and how it redrew the borders or restored the pre-Napoleonic world order in Europe. And in a way, Kissinger could claim that he was trying to enact his PhD thesis, the ideas behind that thesis, by advocating for the creation of the G7. We all say these days that our research has to have impact, but that's quite a good example of where research can have an impact. More recently, however, we're in a position where we're not talking about the G7 necessarily. Attention has shifted over the last sort of 10, 12 years or so to the group of 20, the G20. Now, the G20 has a very, very similar genesis to the G7. Now, it first met in the top left-hand corner there in 2008 in response to the global economic and financial crisis. Now, the G7, or the G8 as it was then, was seen to have failed to respond to that crisis. When it met in Japan, in Hokkaido, for the Toyako summit in the summer of 2008. At that summit, the focus was very much on climate change. Global economic situation didn't even feature on the agenda. And what we had was obviously Lehman Brothers collapse and then the global financial crisis that followed. So the G8 was largely seen to have been a failure in responding to that particular crisis. And there have been questions asked about it, well, there have been questions asked about the G7 and the G8 throughout its lifetime. But over the last sort of 20 years or so, there have been many more questions asked about whether it was relevant anymore. Did we have the key countries sat around the table? China being the obvious one that wasn't there. So the G20, which had been meeting, the G20 had been meeting again as a finance ministers meeting in the same way as the G7 had met as a finance ministers meeting before it was upgraded. I think I'm going to get a home invasion here. Alex, is that you? Do you want to say hello to everyone in Spain?
No, Dad, I'm going to tell something to you, Dad.
Do you want to whisper it in my ear quickly?
Hello, Alex.
Yes, you can see Mum and she'll help you with that, okay?
No, Mum said I can't do it.
Okay, just a sec. Sorry, everyone, I won't be a minute.
Hello, we can take these minutes to say, hola Julia, muchas gracias por haber aceptado formar parte hoy de este gathering intelectual para hacer de discussion después durante el turno de las preguntas y de la discusión. Y bueno, simplemente esto, veo que ya regresa el ponente, así que many thanks.
I'm so sorry about that.
No problem at all.
Don't worry.
Don't worry.
This is the new normal, right? This is what happens.
I just was saying thanks to Julia for joining us also as discussant. So thank you, Julia, and well, let's listen now the speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for your patience and understanding. The basic narrative was that G7, G8 had failed in response to the crisis, and the G20 was necessary. It was bringing the right countries around the table, so they upgraded it from the ministers level to the leaders level. You had the G7 included, but you also had BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. You had the middle powers, the MICTA countries: Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and Australia. You also had Argentina included, Saudi Arabia, and the European Union, who have representation in the G7, G8, were also in the G20. So it was a sort of similar kind of evolution. Also, the nature of the G20 is similar, with a focus on informality. It has no legal right to exist. It exists because the leaders want it to, and it was seen to be a useful mechanism in coordinating the global response to the financial crisis. So it worked very well as a crisis committee. And it met twice a year initially, in 2009 and 2010. As the crisis abated, it met on an annual basis. And there have been questions around its relevance and its direction now that the crisis is over. Once you create one of these groups, it's very difficult to uncreate it, if you want to use that made-up word. But the general narrative is that the G20 is seen to be the relevant organization now. And you can see this just in terms of the statistics. So the G7 represents 10% of the world population. The G20 represents 2/3 of the world's population. The G7 represents 40% of global GDP, whereas the G20 represents 85% of global GDP. So in 2009, at the Pittsburgh summit, the G20 declared itself to be the premier forum for international economic cooperation. And that has been the generally accepted narrative. This year, we're going to see Italy hosting the G20 later in the year, in October, I think, if memory serves. And we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens there. And I think the pandemic would be the obvious issue in building back better. Since then, as I say, it has gone through a similar, well, it's got a similar genesis to the G7, and it's gone through a similar sort of development more recently. Its role and agenda have evolved. It's expanded to include security. At the Antalya summit in Turkey, there was discussion on the sidelines about the situation in Syria, for example. It started to talk about climate change. That was an issue at the G20 in Hamburg in 2017. But we've also seen that the crisis has abated, the financial crisis has abated, and it's tried to deal with more difficult issues such as climate change. You can see that the diversity in its membership has started to become a bit of an issue. And this is where it differs from the G7. The G7 is a group of like-minded countries with similar values. The G20 has a very broad and diverse membership. So you have Saudi Arabia at one extent, Canada at another extent. There's quite a broad range in between those two countries. And also, as the crisis has abated, the G20 hasn't necessarily made the move from a crisis committee to a steering committee. People have tried to imbue it with that role, but it's not quite managed to assume that role that people have wanted. And it's also had its own issues of representation as well. You know, the G20 doesn't solve all the illegitimacy issues that the G7 had experienced. Now, what this has resulted in, whether it's a G7 or a G20, is that, okay, so the basic narrative that the G20 is the only show in town and the G7 doesn't matter anymore, basically did not happen. The G7 continued to meet, despite being written off, and Cornwall seems to be stronger than it's ever been. So, as I say, once we create these groups, it's very difficult to get rid of them. And what we now have is messy multilateralism, or this gaggle of Gs. And I tried to sort of capture the nature of this in a Venn diagram. I should say that I essentially failed to capture the messiness of it. I'd hopefully got some of it, but it's way more complicated than what I've got here. So what we've got here is, I mean, what's not on this chart actually, first and foremost, is the idea of it. Some people have said that there's a G0. There's no consortium of states who are steering the global economy or global governance more broadly. A G0 is what we have. But at the heart of this Venn diagram, I've put a G2. Now this is an imagined G2, but it's the G2 of China and America, China-America, if you like. Now they overlap neatly with the G7 and, if you like, the G5 of the BRICS countries. So America is part of this imagined G2, but it's part of the actual G7 as well. China is part of this imagined G2 and part of the G5, the BRICS countries. So there's a bit of overlap there. Now, all of those countries are part of a G14, which was suggested, put forward at one point. And the idea, this was put forward by the French President Sarkozy. And the idea was to include the G7, the G5, and add to that other countries, including Mexico and Egypt. This was at the sort of height of the Arab Spring. We then had a G16 proposed as well by Japan. The idea was that that would include the G7 plus Russia when it was a G8. We'd also have Australia, South Korea, Indonesia, and other rising powers, and it would be focused on climate change. So the idea is you have a variable geometry. You get the right countries around the table in order to deal with the issue that they need to be there to discuss. So you need Australia there to talk about climate change. And then it goes through to a G20, which I've talked about already. But then again, you know, there's 175 countries outside of the G20 who don't get to participate. What about them? Now, Singapore has set itself up as a representative of the 3G group, the global governance group, and tries to input the voices of non-G20 countries into the process. But you could take this to the extreme and say, well, why don't we have a G195? You know, we have the formal Centre of Global Governance in the form of the United Nations. Why don't we have an informal source of global governance as well, and take this G concept, this informal concept, to its logical extreme, if you like. Okay, so what I want to do quickly is just take a little detour and want to just talk about two suggestions. One for the G7 as regards to the direction it should take, and one for the G20. I've got some links to articles which I'll not put in the chat now, I'll put in the chat later on when I've stopped sharing the screen. And the first of these is sort of, well, it's based on a paper that we recently published in a journal called Global Policy, called How Informality Can Address Emerging Issues, Making the Most of the G7. And in very, very simple terms, the argument is based on this table. And what we tried to do in the article was basically plot various organizations on the basis of formality and diversity. So you'll have in the top left-hand corner highly formal and highly diverse organizations like the United Nations or the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. You then have very formal but quite like-minded groups like the European Union. Then we get into the informal. So the G20, highly diverse in its membership, but informality is what distinguishes it. It's sort of similar to the World Economic Forum in a way, highly diverse in terms of membership, but an informal grouping. And then we have the G7, like-minded shared values, values of democracy, free markets, rule of law, human rights, and so on. Very like-minded and informal. And our argument is basically because the G7 occupies this distinct position, it should focus on trying to address newly emerging, highly disruptive issues, the kind of issues that sort of characterize the very complex world in which we live. Now, the G7 shouldn't try to engage with well-understood international problems that fit into neat existing categories and already have a natural home. You know, there's already an organization tasked with dealing with issues like global security or whatever it may be. The G7's beauty is that it's informal and flexible enough to deal with the kind of issues that are emerging in our complex world. So issues such as artificial intelligence, issues such as cryptocurrencies, issues that haven't sort of quite found the right home yet. The G7 can play an important role by being a group of like-minded leaders with the same interests and the same values, but also being informal enough to be able to adapt to those new issues. It should be the first port of call for dealing with those issues. It may then delegate those issues to an official organization, as it has done in the past. But that's the role that the G7 should play. I'll share the link. I've given you the reference there. I'll share the link with you when I've stopped sharing the screen. As regards the G20, one interesting development that happened when the G20 first met at the leaders level was that there was a lot of discussion about the expanded Asian membership of this group. So as an original G7 member, Japan is now joined by Australia. I'm defining Asia very broadly here, but Australia, China, India, Indonesia, and South Korea. So you've got this alphanumeric configuration of an A6, the Asian 6. And the idea that some people spoke about was that membership of the G20 might force or encourage these countries into some kind of coordination with each other, some kind of caucusing ahead of G20 summits. That's what Europe does, after all, to ensure a coordinated response at the G20 summit. However, looking at concrete behavior since the rise of the G20, what you actually see amongst these countries is divergent agendas and competition even. So it's either it's very difficult to find common ground, or there's too much common ground and they're competing over it. So this can sort of be seen across a range of different areas of G20 activity. It can be sort of seen in promoting national interests versus promoting the norm of internationalism. It can be seen in terms of claiming a regional leadership role. Practically every country there is trying to be the leader of Asia in the G20. Or acting as a bridge between developing and developed countries by promoting certain models of sustainable development. Again, either these countries are divergent or they're in competition with each other. And again, I've got a paper there which I'll share with you there, which is talking about the G20 as a possible engine of Asian regionalism that I wrote for the German think tank GIGA a number of years ago. Now, as I say, initially, it seemed that this Asian 6 wasn't going to work. Asian regionalism wasn't going to be driven forward by the G20. However, we have sort of seen over recent years a possible move in this direction. And this revolves around more of an Asian 3 in a way, between China, South Korea, and Japan. Now, if you take the example of the G20 summit in Hamburg in 2017, what you had were a series of bilateral meetings between the leaders of all of those 3 countries. So the day before the summit, Moon Jae-in and Xi Jinping met, which proved to be a positive meeting discussing North Korea, the whole THAAD anti-missile system in South Korea. On the first day of the summit, Abe Shinzo and Moon Jae-in met and tried to stress the sort of future-oriented nature of their relationship and tried to agree the resumption of reciprocal visits. And on the last day of the summit, Xi Jinping and Abe Shinzo met in what seemed to be the beginning of the reset in Sino-Japanese relations and planning out future mutual visits. So it seemed to be that creating these bilateral meetings could provide a jumping off point to create a sort of mesh that might constitute an Asian 3 in Northeast Asia, at least. I know you mentioned Christopher Dent has spoken to before. He has talked about how mesh regionalism can emerge through bilateral interactions. And there could be potential for something similar happening here, the bilaterals that happen at G20 summits, resulting in more coordination between at least the Asian 3 of Northeast Asia. And this could expand to an Asian 6 as well. Now, one thing I've suggested elsewhere, especially with a colleague, Greg Chin from York University in Canada, is that the G20 should create some kind of permanent secretariat. I say it's an informal organization, depends on the host government. But if it had some kind of secretariat who could ensure consistency between summits, locating that in Asia, possibly using an organization like the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat, the TCS, that would maybe give a bit greater stimulus to regional cooperation between at least the 3 countries of Northeast Asia. So in the time I've got left, what I'd like to talk about is Japan's response to this whole gaggle of G and how successfully has Japan navigated this sort of difficult terrain. Now, Japan's response to this has been, it's been based on national interest, certainly. We can cite examples where Japan does go to the G7 and G20 summit purely trying to promote national interest. But there are a number of norms as well which have shaped Japan's behavior. So bilateralism, have an image to sort of capture the closeness of the US-Japan bilateral relationship. This is Nakasone and Ronald Reagan at the 1983 Williamsburg summit, where they presented each other with these specially embossed baseball jackets. And Reagan said that he was going to be the pitcher and Nakasone had to be the catcher, so stressing the close relationship between the two. And this is an important point. Japan has always used the G7 to manage the bilateral relationship with the US. I mean, one sort of high-profile example of this was Barack Obama's final G7 summit in 2016, which took place in East Hiroshima, but as soon as it finished, Barack Obama was flown to Hiroshima and became the first incumbent US president to visit the Peace Garden at Hiroshima, a hugely symbolic event. But Japan has made the most of G7 summits to meet with the US president in the bilaterals, or to use the summit more broadly as an opportunity to reinforce the relationship. That hasn't changed with the Gaggle of Gs, with the rise in the role of the G20. Japan is still trying to do this, especially Abe's role as sort of chief Trump whisperer. He tried to get as close to Trump at the summits as he could, as close as possible. The other role that Japan has applied to itself is the representative of Asia. Asianism has informed Japan's role within the G7. It was Asia's only representative, the only non-Western member, and this cartoon, which you might be able to make out the slogan there, but this comes from a Japanese newspaper at the time of the 1998 G8 summit in Birmingham in the UK. And you have all the leaders gathered around the microphone trying to decide on the declaration. You've got the UK host, Prime Minister Blair, looking on at Prime Minister Hashimoto, who's desperately trying to plug the G8 microphone into the plug hole of various Asian issues. Now, you've only got 2 prongs to that plug, but you've got 3 holes because there's so many Asian issues. Can all of those issues be included in the G8 declaration? Now, this is quite a nice visualization that captures the way in which Japan has tried to ensure that Asian issues, like the 1997 Asian financial crisis, gets attention at the G7 and G8 summit. And if Japan wasn't there, often these issues just would fall by the wayside. Now, with the upgrade of the G7 to a G20, to be honest, Japan has struggled to play that role as Asia's representative because of the inclusion of other Asian countries, and also as a result of it failing to secure the role of host of the G20. So South Korea was the first Asian country to host a G20 in 2010. And then in 2016, Japan lost out to China, who hosted the Hangzhou summit. It was 2019 when Japan got to host its first G20 summit in Osaka. So that Asian role, that defining role for Japan has been difficult to transplant to the G20. As regards internationalism, what I mean by this is the idea that Japan wants to be a good global citizen. It wants to respond to the idea that it's a responsible member of international society. And one good indication of this in the G7 is the G7 research group in Toronto ranks all the summits, gives them grades. And if you look at the various G7 countries who've hosted summits over time, Japan has hosted 6 G7 summits. Japan consistently gets higher grades than other countries. Remember, Japan was excluded from other mechanisms of global governance, like the United Nations, for a number of years. It only joined the UN in 1956. It's still referred to in the UN Charter as an enemy nation, although that clause is defunct, but it's still symbolic. And Japan is kept out of the UN Security Council, despite being one of the largest donors to the UN budget. However, in the G7, its status was recognized from day one. So Japan has responded to that great power status that the G7 has accorded to Japan and tried to ensure that G7 summits have been successful. Now, Japan was put in a bit of a difficult situation with the upgrade to the G20. It didn't want to be held responsible for an unsuccessful G20. It wants the G20 to succeed, but it doesn't want the G20 to succeed to the extent that it eclipses the G7. It wants the G7 to continue, the G7 which guarantees its status as a great power and its position as Asia's representative. So Japan initially, from 2008, I would say through to the time that Prime Minister Abe returned to power in 2012, was in a bit of a difficult situation. It found itself hampered by this contradiction. It wants to be a good global citizen, but it doesn't want the G20 to succeed too much so that it eclipses the G7. Now, more recently, I've mentioned an Abe doctrine. And a number of people have written about, myself included, have written about the idea that there's an Abe doctrine, which now replaces the Yoshida doctrine. So the Yoshida doctrine shaped Japan's post-war foreign policy. It was a doctrine that stressed reliance on the US for Japan's security needs, while Japan focused on being an economic animal and recovering from defeat in the war and regaining its great power status. Now, the Yoshida doctrine, that foreign policy doctrine, was only ever meant to be temporary, but it became sort of pathologized within Japanese foreign policy and led to the sort of reactive state that we've seen in the post-Cold War period. The Abe doctrine, some people have suggested, is a much more sort of dynamic direction for Japan's foreign policy. And there are 4 elements to it. So on the one hand, it's trying to stop Japan's decline. It's trying to secure Japan's great power status. That's the objective of the Abe doctrine. Second, following on from that, in order to achieve that, Japan needs to get rid of certain shackles, certain barriers that have stopped Japan from playing a proactive role in the world. The Constitution and Article 9 would be the obvious ones that have hampered Japan in playing this proactive role in the world. Also part of this, and this is partly down to Abe's personality and his own belief system, historical revisionism has been an element of the Abe doctrine. Revisiting certain historical issues to promote a less apologetic, a less sort of self-flagellizing view of Japan's history. Abe has tried to stress the idea that the history is in the past and Japan is different now and we should just move on. And the fourth element of the Abe doctrine, and I think this is probably one of the most important elements, but it often gets ignored, is Abenomics, an economically strong Japan. The thing is, Japan can't secure its great power status or do all the other things it wants to do in terms of making a proactive contribution to peace if its economy isn't strong. So Abenomics has been a key element of that. Now, under Abe, what this meant was that you had a much more sort of strategic and coherent approach to global governance. It might be based around a rather sort of narrow interests of the Abe doctrine, a rather realist doctrine, and it's certainly at the expense of internationalism to a degree. But it did demonstrate that Japan was being much more joined up in its thinking and its behavior in the G7 and the G20 under Abe. So what you saw was, in terms of those 4 elements of the Abe doctrine, you saw Japan regularly going out and stressing its great power status at these summits, whether it was the G7 or whether it was the G20. It was able in the G7 to stress the like-minded nature of the G7 and carve out a distinct role for it to play based on those shared values. But in the G20, it was also eager to stress that G7 is at the core of the G20. And Japan at the core of that. Again, within G7 and G20 and other mechanisms of global governance, the United Nations in particular, Abe has stressed a proactive contribution to peace. You've seen a sort of emphasis on the role of human security, Japan's sort of ideological contribution to our understanding of security. But Japan is coming up with ideas, it's contributing personnel as well. And making a proactive contribution. Weirdly enough, historical revisionism has even emerged. At the G7 summit in 2013 that was held in Northern Ireland, the emphasis was put on the role of women in conflict. And Japan played an active role in ensuring a common G7 position on this issue and creating a fund associated with that to address the disproportionate effect that conflict has on women. But there was an interesting sort of element to that, and that was that Japan was very keen to stress that this was not historical. This was not going to talk about the comfort women in particular. So it was forward-looking, the emphasis as far as Japan was concerned. And in terms of the Osaka summit in 2019, you saw Japan firmly converted to the idea of the G20 having a distinct role to play, and Japan able to sort of balance out its roles between the two. It was able to be a proactive leader within the G20, moving forward with its own agenda, particularly on the free flow of data, but still maintain a key role for the G7. Now, this has all played out over a turbulent time in Japanese politics. So that era of confusion when the G20 was created in 2008 coincided with the time that the LDP left power and the Democratic Party of Japan took over from 2009 to 2012. So maybe it wasn't completely, it's not completely difficult to understand why Japan sort of responded quite badly to this challenge when the DPJ were very much finding their feet in that early period. But then you have consistency from 2012 onwards in terms of the Abe Doctrine starting to appear in Japan's response to global governance and the Gaggle of Gs at the expense of internationalism. But now you sort of see a greater commitment since the G20 in Osaka in 2019. But one key question which could undermine all that is what's going to happen in a post-Abe world. What to expect of Suga, who, you know, we've now come up to about a year of Prime Minister Suga. He's participated in a virtual G20 summit in Riyadh. Very difficult to get a sense of what kind of summit participant he would be because, you know, this was not a physical summit. He did travel to Cornwall recently for the G7 summit. My take on Suga, and this might come up in the questions and answers, but my take on Suga is that he is, I mean, Suga was the longest serving chief cabinet secretary. He was sort of Abe's enforcer in a way, who worked behind the scenes, if you like. I think that's where his skill set lies. And Suga almost needs his own Suga in order to work behind the scenes. And I think that we're also going to see a possible period of turbulence. Suga has 2 elections coming up, one for the leadership of the LDP, and then there'll be an election, a nationwide election later in the year. So it might well be that we see a return to the revolving door of Japanese prime ministers that we saw between Koizumi and Abe. And that will inevitably impact on Japan's role within these summits as well. If we don't know who's turning up to the summit, we'll never know. And it reminds me of a comment, and this is where I'll end, it reminds me of a comment from the Brazilian president who, the G20, who in a press conference had forgotten the name of the Japanese prime minister. And his reaction was very much just to say, hey, look, you meet one guy in the morning, you meet another guy in the evening. And that's the revolving door of Japanese politics. So thanks very much for listening to me. I've got my contact details there, webpage, email, Twitter, Facebook. You've got no excuse for not getting in touch with me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Hugo, for this thoughtful lecture. It was great. And now I want to say thanks again to Julia for joining us. Julia Bañeras is our discussant. So Julia, the floor is yours. And well, everybody can post her questions in our chat. So let's start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Blai. Thank you very much, Professor Dobson, for this in-depth look to Japan's engagement with the Gaggling Gs and its complexities. And thank you, Blai, again for the invitation. It's very nice to be back and even see some familiar names among the attendees. So please feel free to drop any question you have. Professor Dobson's presentation was great and it went into very interesting details, but please feel free to drop in more general questions if you feel like it could be interesting. Thank you. For me, one of the interesting points of your presentation, Professor, is that it's always very refreshing to look at the mechanisms through which a container can shape its content and not be considered just as a mere vessel, this time with symmetry. As you said, the Gs are very poorly understood. And I have the feeling that this kind of messy or blurry nature is one of the ways in which their same nature shapes how the results produced are perceived. And here, well, this is something that makes many questions pop in my head, but I would like to address it from the point of view of the media and the role they play in creating this container. As you have given a course on Japan's role in the world through images in the last days, I would like, if possible, to show an image now to introduce my first question. I don't know if I can share it quickly. It's a picture of the recent G7 summit in Cornwall, and it's one of the pictures that I have seen more consistently reported in Japanese media, with of course the accompanying title of Suga Hitoribocchi, like all by himself, not being engaged in the small talk that's so important in summitry. So I wanted to continue a bit with the reflection that you were making at the end on Suga's role, and maybe also beyond Suga's role. Is this Abe doctrine that you were talking about really finished with Abe? And what do you think are the ingredients to make it long-lived in the LDP, considering the nature that I was talking about and that you explained so well of the G7? Thank you.
That's great, Julia. Thank you ever so much. I think you've hit on a really, really interesting aspect there, and that's the way we understand these summits through the media, the way the media presents it. And so I've been fortunate enough to work in the media center at a lot of these summits since 2008 and the Toyako summits in Japan. Lucky enough to write for the journal Global Policy. And it's fascinating to sort of see what's going on within the media at these summits. It's periods of either boredom or mass excitement. I think it was Orson Welles who said, you only ever feel two emotions when flying in a plane, boredom or terror. And it's a bit like that with G7 and G20 summits. It's either journalists are sat around twiddling their thumbs, drinking free beer at the bar or whatever, or they're running around like crazy trying to submit their stories at the last minute. And one thing that's struck me, I mean, I hope there's no journalists in the audience, but what has struck me is that the journalists don't necessarily understand a huge amount about the summit. They don't understand the format, as you said, like the container. They might understand what it contains. They might be interested in the issues of climate change, and they're always interested in the leaders and the personalities and those kind of things. But they don't necessarily understand the nature of the G7, what it can do and what it can't do. So, I mean, one thing I've tried to do when I've been in the media center at these summits is put myself out there as a talking head who can provide some kind of context to the media reporting that takes place. Because otherwise it just gets presented as, so the G7 is either a pointless exercise, it's either a waste of time, or it's an evil capitalist plot that controls the world. Now, it can't be both of those things. It's probably going to be somewhere in the middle, and trying to get across the sense of what it can do. Don't expect big, huge changes to come out of G7, G8 summits. Sometimes that will happen. Sometimes if the leaders are galvanized enough, there will be a big breakthrough. So, the 2005 G8 summit in Gleneagles got a lot of attention. There was the Live Aid concert in London. There was a huge focus on what they could deliver in terms of Africa. And they did make some high-profile commitments there. And again, the G7 in Cornwall has made some high-profile commitments in terms of what it's going to do in terms of vaccine donations. Now, whether they deliver on that is always, that's the job of civil society and academics to hold them to account and make sure they do deliver on those promises. But these summits, they're much more sort of incremental. Issues will be discussed throughout the year on year. They'll revisit them time and time again, and they'll make incremental change. And often the G7 or the G20 would delegate the issue to a formal organization. So the G7 or the G8, when it met in Okinawa in 2000, agreed on a range of efforts to address diseases, parasitic diseases. And that led to the creation of the Global Health Fund, which has generally been regarded as a success, but people don't associate it with the G7 or the G8. So the successes can get lost in the mix. So you're absolutely right, the media plays a key role in that. And you mentioned about Suga being sort of hitoribochi. I mean, that again is fascinating because the Japanese press since the 1970s they've always focused on the leader's photograph and tried to plot where the Japanese prime minister is. And, the place on the very far end has always been referred to as the sort of the reserved position for the Japanese prime minister, and he's felt a little bit on the limb, maybe not that confident in these informal discussions. Sure, you've had prime ministers like Nakasone, Koizumi. I mean, Koizumi was able to really sort of strike a chord with some of the other G8 leaders, and Abe as well, who seem to be sort of quite comfortable in this kind of role. But traditionally, yeah, I think it's the 3 S's of the Japanese prime minister, that he's smiling, he's just smiling politely, he's silent in the meetings, and sometimes he's sleeping. That's the way the Japanese press have often sort of characterized the prime minister's role. But to get to your question about, the Abe doctrine and how that might develop and embed itself in Japanese foreign policy. I mean, I think in terms of foreign policy, Suga has largely been setting out the message that it's business as usual, that things aren't going to change, that he's largely the architect of a lot of Abe's policies anyway. So it would be surprising to see any huge change. I think there might be a slight shift in emphasis, but no great changes taking place with Suga. How long Suga will be around? We'll see. I mean, things have not been going well in terms of Japan's sort of vaccine. It's getting going with the vaccine rollout, starting to get some momentum, but I don't think Suga's sort of getting a huge amount of praise for the response to the pandemic. But I think whoever replaces Suga, if it was, I don't know, Kono Taro, for example, I think any of the candidates would largely be pursuing a similar foreign policy line to Abe. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon in the near future. But I mean, thank you, Julia, for raising all those excellent points about the nature of the forum as well as the nature of Japan's participation. Shall I go to Yvette's question?
Yes, I think it's complementary with what you were talking about. So yes, please.
Brilliant. Okay. So thanks for that, Yvette. As Julia said, it's not out of the blue at all. Very complimentary. Yeah, so I mean, the thing about the G7 and the G8 and the G20 is that they don't have any means to enforce their decisions. So yeah, I mean, I think what they're doing is trying to exercise some kind of soft power. They're often trying to use the weight of who they are to try and back up the decisions. And in fact, I mean, you can see an interesting strategy that the Japanese government have sometimes used with reference to domestic policies that depends upon the sort of legitimacy that a G7 or a G20 commitment can have. So, for example, Prime Minister Noda attended the summits and went to the summit specifically to bring the issue. I mean, he talked to other leaders about the issue of a consumption tax rise, got the general approval of fellow leaders, was able to then go back to Japan and say, well, I know this is controversial, but look, I've got the approval of the other leaders. So, you know, this is now almost like an international commitment that we've made. And similarly, you could see Abe doing that with Abenomics. He was going every G7 and G20 summit. The Japanese government was making efforts to explain Abenomics, show how Japan was proactively trying to address 20 years of economic stagnation. And if the G7 or the G20 in its declaration said, we have heard and support Japan's efforts to revitalize its economy under Prime Minister Abe, Abe could then use that to say, well, look, I've got international approval for what I'm saying we should do, and that's a commitment of sorts. So it is soft power. It's sort of trying to use persuasion rather than sort of coercion, certainly. And have the summits been more impactful than a political tool than meetings held by recognized organizations like the UN? I think it's very difficult to compare the two, because I mean the UN is the recognized, legitimate, legal center of global governance, and you know the G7 and G20 are not in competition. They don't want to be in competition with the United Nations. I think there was, when the G20 emerged in 2008, there were in UN circles a bit of concern that this seemed to be some kind of sort of rival, an informal rival to the UN. But you know, the UN Secretary General attends these meetings often, as do other representatives from WTO or the World Bank and so on. So I think it's more of a sort of family of organizations and institutions and forums. And what's necessary, and this has been necessary for a long time, is some kind of ordering. There needs to be some kind of spring cleaning of global governance to get over this messy multilateralism. So rather than organizations all trying to do the same thing or address the same issue, we need to go through them all and say, you know, like that simple index that I showed before in terms of diversity and formality, if we can divide out organizations by their membership, by their format, by their nature, we can then task them with the appropriate issue to deal with, and we can see how they relate to each other, how they report to each other, and how they reinforce each other. This is what global governance requires, some kind of ordering. And in fact, at the very first G7 summit that took place in 1975, when it was a G6, this came up on the agenda. People were saying multilateralism is too complicated. We need to stop we can only create a new organization if we get rid of one. One in, one out should be the rule. And people are still saying this today. So I think it's not necessarily a system of competition, but it definitely requires sorting out. It requires some spring cleaning, I would say, in response to that effect. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it does. Fabulous. What I'm going to do in the chat as well, I'm just going to share a couple of links. These are to the articles I mentioned in my presentation. The first one is from Global Policy and is talking about how the G7 can make the most of its informality. And the other one is from the Gaggle working paper, which is about the role of the Asian Six within the G20. Forgive the shameless self-promotion. I hope you find them useful in some way.
No, please. Thank you so much. My second question is a bit related to the Asian Six, but I would like to pinpoint a new Gaggling member. It's the Quad. So it's the quadrilateral talks by Australia, India, Japan, and the US on Indo-Pacific security. As you all can probably deduce, this is directly looking at China. And if I understand it correctly, I have read that it is Abe's brainchild. And but anyway, this is the new toy of Indo-Pacific security pundits. And I would like to ask you how it plays into the trilateral negotiations that they were talking about between China, Korea, and Japan, and the bilateral negotiations between these countries, which I believe are key and vital, especially seeing the hawkish drift in the West against China. So do you think the Quad could cripple the ambitions of this intra-Asian dialogue? I have heard that many experts say that the Quad shouldn't be seen as a new, how can I put it, full-fledged type of G, let's call it like that, as the others, and it has much less power than it seems. But I would like to have to hear your opinion on it. Thank you.
That's a great question, Julia. Really, really relevant. I mean, the Quad is sort of, it's a bit of a unexpected success on the part of Abe. I don't think anyone sort of really necessarily expected him to pull off the creation of this informal grouping. I mean, it's a mechanism by which Japan can play a more proactive role in security issues. It brings together, you know, the shared values amongst these sort of key partners. And it's a natural extension of what Japan has been doing for some time. It's, you know, once upon a time it was talked about bilateralism plus, that was the term that was used, that you had the core bilateral relationship, and Japan was trying to diversify beyond the core relationship with the US by building relationships, security relationships with Australia, with India. So it's a natural sort of extension, and I think sort of maybe it's not that controversial because it's maybe not that surprising. It's been sort of in gestation for quite some time. But I think it's going to depend very much on what's going on alongside it. So, you know, if the discussions can take place alongside a more meaningful trilateral discussion between the countries of Northeast Asia, then I think, you know, both can sit quite nicely together. I think it's the issue of emphasis, isn't it? It's where are you going to put most of your effort? And Japan sort of, I mean, my feeling is that Japan sort of usually tends to walk that fine line quite successfully. I think Koizumi, for example, was really adept at avoiding, you know, the relationship with America was always based around the idea of the tension between entrapment and abandonment. You don't want to get so close to America that you get entrapped in its wars, but equally, you don't want to sort of be so independent of America or such a poor ally that you get abandoned. But Koizumi was always able to sort of walk that line quite carefully. And I think it's going to come down to the skill of, you know, it's going to be the political leadership that's injected into this. Can you walk that fine line between continuing, you know, the reset in Sino-Japanese relations was definitely a good development, and Abe was quite skilled in pushing that forward. Relations with South Korea, actually, I mean, that's one issue that we should single out, because that's one area that really, you know, that was the first item that Suga really needed to address as Prime Minister. You know, obviously the pandemic came along and distracted attention, but that's one area which really sort of requires remedial attention at the moment, I would say. But it's going to come down to what kind of politician is leading Japan. I mean, it's an interesting time that we're talking about actual leadership within Japan. Usually we just talked about the Prime Minister as being a fairly peripheral character, but, you know, now we're seeing that a leader like Koizumi and a leader like Abe can really have a huge impact on Japan's role in the world and ultimate success as well. Does that help in any way? Does that?
Yes, thank you very much.
Good.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. I had a couple of questions more. We have time. I think it's a bit linked with what you were saying about Japan's leadership and where it puts its emphasis, but it's about the last Cornwall Summit results, let's call it that way. It's about the press release by the members of the G7 after the Cornwall Summit regarding forced labor. as the participants may know, there was a condemnation of forced labor in the note that they released, and apparently Japan was one of the countries that was less inclined to add this mention to forced labor, and of course not mentioning China, which I have read that the US was very keen on including. So this is one of the, this shows that really we don't even see even 1% of what's going on behind, because we can imagine the struggle to put up this page. But my question is, how does this ambivalent position of Japan towards China compared to the US play with Japan's increased interest in the G20 that you were mentioning? As you said, and I have seen it with my own eyes, Japan is always valued as a like-minded partner by Western powers, including the European Union. So I was wondering, how can they play this ambivalent card in an international stage where Biden is going more and more, well, not more and more, but at least more hawkish than initially expected, and the EU is getting increasingly to that side. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Japan has a history of playing this kind of bridging role. And I think, you know, if we look back to a similar situation with Tiananmen Square in 1989, we had a similar situation where the West was very keen to introduce sanctions through G7 discussions, to really sort of come down harshly on China and to, you know, be very critical. And Japan sort of managed to play that in-between role, that sort of role of liaising and softening the Western approach in a way. So Japan does have sort of quite a track record of ensuring that sort of China isn't singled out by its fellow G7 members. If it can carry on doing that, I mean, back in Tiananmen Square, it's really down to the sort of skill of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs bureaucrats. I'm sure they're still very skilled in doing this kind of thing. I mean, it partly comes back to my point about political leadership being hugely important as well. But I would expect Japan, I mean, over recent years, even under Abe, Japan was very, it would be critical of China, but it would always do it in a very veiled way. You know, it would always sort of make allusion to the values that bring the G7 together. And, you know, when it was talking about the rule of law in the South China Sea, this was always very, very critical of China, but it would sort of do it in a sort of slightly veiled way. Or it would almost use Russia as that, you know, you can be critical of Russia and that would be a gateway to then be critical of China. You can see these kind of sort of techniques that Japan would adopt within G7 communications. So I would expect more of the same balancing on the part of Japan. I was just thinking, looking at the time, at the beginning I promised you a joke about the G7 and the G8, didn't I? And maybe that would be a sort of way to sort of to wrap up. Shall I go for it?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the G7 and the G8 aren't necessarily the most amusing subjects in the world, but there are some amusing things which have happened at summits. And I'm going to take you back to 1998 and the Birmingham G8 summit. And there was an event that happened at a concert. There was a concert held in the evening for the G8 leaders. And one band decided to play the Beatles, All You Need Is Love. Now, I'm sure everybody knows that song. And if you think about it, how does the song begin? It begins with the French national anthem. Now, upon hearing this, Jacques Chirac, all the leaders were sat in a line. Jacques Chirac stood up, saluted, you know, La Patrie, and all the other leaders around him. And this sort of symbolizes the whole point of the G8. They all got up, so Jacques didn't look ridiculous, and all the leaders stood up around him. And then suddenly the song kicks in that it's actually All You Need Is Love by the Beatles. And they all start doing dad dancing and doing a rather embarrassing dance when they realize it's the Beatles. But it was a great moment. You can actually, I think you can find it on YouTube. And it just showed how the G8 stick together. You know, they try to sort of support each other and not single out any member. So again, your point, Julia, it comes back to the whole form of these organizations as well. So thank you very much, Julia, for all your comments, and thanks to the questions as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. It was a very interesting conversation, and it's a pity that we need to close it already. We're 3 minutes behind time. But yes, really, thank you very much. I think you have given us a lot of tools to look at the coming summits with new eyes and see more things that we weren't able to see up to now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and sorry for the child invasion as well.
No, no problem. It has been great. So terrific. Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought. We have enjoyed it and learned it a lot. So thank you, Professor Dobson, for this thoughtful lecture and for being so generous, sharing with us your knowledge. And thank you, Julia, for your thoughtful questions too. So thank you very much, David. This is our last lecture in this lecture series. But for sure, if Casa Asia wants, we are very grateful to Casa Asia. We will do it again. We will repeat again with a new lecture series the next academic year, David. The micro, David, sorry.
Sorry, it's been a great way of ending our seminars, and we are really thankful to Hugo and Julia for their participation. And as Blai said, we hope that next year we can continue with these seminars, which I think they are really, really interesting and very, very good. Thank you very much to all of you, Casa Asia, and see you next year, hopefully.
Well, thank you to you. Thank you to Hugo and Julia, of course, from Casa Asia. And we are expecting to continue this collaboration. We are really happy, and I think it's important for Casa Asia to increase our collaboration with other institutions, and your university for us is a very key partner. So you can count on us, and we can start preparing the next lecture series whenever you want. So thank you to all of you for your work, and we keep in touch.
Okay, good, excellent.
Thank you so much. So
thank you very much,
everyone. Thank you to the audience, and thanks for your comments. So
thank you.
Thanks, Hugo, Julia.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Keep in touch, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.